Whether you're looking to build a website for your business, your hobby, your podcast, or just for fun, Pair Networks is your go-to web hosting partner. Not only do we have the lowest domain price in the industry, starting at just $11, we've got hundreds of stunning website templates to help you stand out from the crowd. You're not a techie? Not a problem. With our easy DIY site builders, you can launch your impressive website without any technical know-how. And when it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. Check out pair.com today to learn more. PAIR.com.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Kemper Donovan.
I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And this week, we do not have a novel. We do not have a short story. That's right. We have a very special episode. And honestly, we are so excited.
We're so excited about it. Yes.
Just call us Jessie Spano.
I'm so excited! I'm so scared!
I have to say, I'm not scared at all. I have no trepidation about this.
No, and we were not even on diet pills while recording it.
Jessie, give me those.
I need them back! I have to sing!
So, Catherine Brobeck, what are we so excited about? What is this episode all about?
We are talking in this episode to somebody who I think many listeners are going to get excited about too. We're talking to Ruth Ware.
Mystery novelist extraordinaire. Honestly, we should just get right into it because we had quite the lively, roving conversation. She could not have been more generous, and we really are so grateful that she took the time to speak with us. We're about to get all telephonic. We'll see you on the other side, I suppose.
We're so thrilled to have Ruth Ware with us today. I'm sure most, if not all, of our listeners realize that Ruth is the author of 5 recent mystery novels that are quite beloved in their own right, but which frequently get what for us, I guess, is the ultimate compliment. And that would be, of course, comparisons to one, Dame Agatha Christie herself. And it's been on our wish list to have her on the podcast for some time now. Thank you so much, Ruth, for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's so much fun to be, among fellow Agatha appreciators. So I'm very happy to be here.
We often, in our episodes, as we're going through Christie's novels, at the top do a little publication history. And I kind of think that's in order here, just to make sure that all the listeners are on the same page as to what exactly we are talking about. To date, you have published 5 fabulous mystery books. Those would be In a Dark, Dark Wood in 2015. The Woman in Cabin 10 in 2016, The Lying Game in 2017, The Death of Mrs. Westaway in 2018, and The Turn of the Key in 2019. And having just run through those titles, it's pretty hard not to notice that you have, dare I say, almost a Christie-esque work ethic and work product, apparently, and that you are able to publish a book a year. How is that possible? How do you do that?
Well, when you look at Christie's publication record, I wrote a piece actually about the fact that, we're in very strange times at the moment, and it's very difficult to write for a lot of writers, including me. And, Christie wrote all the way through the Second World War. And I totted up the number of books she wrote, and it was 12 just during the Second World War. So I'm not quite at that level. She was publishing 2 a year sometimes, and I definitely can't write 2 a year. But mine are slightly longer than hers. So I cut myself some slack on that basis. But no, I'm a fairly swift writer, and I don't write incredibly long books. They tend to sort of come in around the 100,000 word mark, which helps. I'm not writing kind of enormous George R.R. Martin style sagas. I don't know. I like writing. And as soon as I stop writing a book, I start thinking about the next one and figuring out who the characters are. But I do think that Christie had one big advantage, which I don't have, which is that she had series characters, whereas I have to reinvent the wheel every single time. And every single time I am convinced I'm not going to be able to do it, that I'm not going to find a voice, that I'm not going to find a narrator, that I'm going to forget how to do it. And I feel like, I don't know, I've never had a detective, but I feel like having the reassurance that, you know, you've got Poirot front and centre and you know him and you know what he does. That must be a great comfort, I would have thought.
Has it occurred to you to create a series-long character?
It definitely has, partly because I would love to have that kind of structure and to have some, even if I didn't write always with the same character, it would be nice to have a returning character. And I do miss my characters a lot. Like, I finish the books and I think about them and I hope they're okay and I wonder what they're up to and things. So there are characters that I would love to return to, but the problem that I always have is the age of the gentleman detective is really over. It's just not plausible that people would allow, you know, Lord Peter Wimsey or someone to come up kind of poking around through their affairs. And I'm not interested in writing police procedurals. You know, I don't know very much about that world. There are authors who do it much better than me. Many of them have actually been in the police, so they have that kind of insider knowledge that it would take a lifetime to get. And it's just really difficult to kind of come up with a reason why a regular, ordinary person would be constantly stumbling over corpses. And you can go the kind of Jessica Fletcher route and sort of just embrace it.
I was about to say Cabot Cove.
You know, they pull it off. Like, you fully accept that every time Jessica opens her front door, there's a dead body outside and no one seems to think that this is suspicious.
I don't know how familiar you are with our podcast, but Kemper will know exactly where I'm going with this. But I certainly have a running joke that Jessica Fletcher is actually a serial killer.
She has to be. I totally agree. It's the only plausible explanation. And probably Nancy Drew as well, let's face it. You know, they're both highly suspicious characters.
Well, Nancy Drew just ends up being tied up in basements all of the time.
So, yeah, until I find my murdering Jessica Fletcher, I can't see myself doing a series character. But yeah, maybe that's it. Maybe I'll just have to write about a serial killer and just embrace it and go kind of full Dexter.
I mean, it makes so much sense to me because I think your books, one of the things that I always appreciate about them is that they are thrillers, so they are heightened situations, but they are always presented in a grounded way. You know, it's sort of the idea of this could actually happen, and oh my God, you know, what would it be like to throw yourself into this situation? And the amateur sleuth in 21st century is not exactly the easiest fit for that sort of scenario. It actually leads me to what was going to be my first question, which was because you don't write detective fiction. And I think that's often what people call a lot of mystery novels, especially that fall in the golden age, which do feature series-long detectives. I think there's a lot of fuzziness with what to call books that fall under the mystery genre, and especially books such as yours, which do include elements of, you know, Christie, but then also thriller and even, you know, quite action-packed thriller at times. And I'm just curious, do you have a preference? Do you care? And because I think there's just often a little bit of confusion as to like what to label something within the genre.
Publishing loves boxes and publishers love boxes, understandably, because they want to know how to shelve you. And it's, you know, it's always difficult. You know, sometimes I end up in crime, sometimes I end up in psychological thrillers, sometimes it's mystery. You know, when I describe myself, I call myself a psychological crime thriller writer, because I agree, I do both. I'm very much in that psychological thriller box where it's one person's experience and it's very interior and it's very, you know, it has that emotional arc that maybe a classic kind of procedural novel doesn't. But I definitely have that trying to solve a crime, whodunit element at the heart of most of my books, which is quite Christie-ish and quite kind of, you know, it has that sort of puzzle element of that contract between reader and writer. So for me, that's me trying to sort of square the circle, but that isn't really a category that exists in bookshops. That's me sort of coining my own term. So
I like that. You're like widening the box as much as possible. You're like psychological crime, thriller.
I'll have everything. Psychological mystery crimes.
Yeah, totally.
I always find it a little bit interesting when I go into our local Barnes & Noble, or when I did before all of this happened, you would see like the weird mystery section. And then, like, for example, your books would sometimes show up in regular literature. So when you were looking for something, you know, it's just a guessing game, I think, of where they're actually categorizing, because, sometimes, like, maybe one day of the week you'd find Ian Rankin on the mystery shelves and you'd find P.D. James in the literature shelves.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's actually a rhyme or reason to what that categorization is.
No, I agree. It's definitely, and it depends how you see the books. Some of my books, all of my books do have a crime at the heart of them, but some of them, like The Lying Game, for example, is actually more a book about relationships and friendships and growing up and the pressures that our kind of loyalties to our friends put on our relationships as an adult. And so, yes, I could fully see how, if you ignore the crime element, it could be a literary novel in a way. It has a strong whodunit theme to it, but then lots of novels do. So.
Well, I mean, on the other hand, what is Crime and Punishment except crime novel?
A novel with a crime at the heart of it. No, exactly. I have to say, I don't feel kind of hemmed in by, my publishers have never said to me, oh, I don't think that's crimey enough, or that doesn't feel like a Ruth Ware novel or anything. So they've been very content for me to figure out what I want to write and then to try and market it afterwards.
Rachel, is so much room within what people call quote unquote mysteries or crime fiction. It's pretty much anything under the sun, which is why those categories sometimes do seem a little beside the point. But, it gives you the latitude to write very different books. And yes, I think what's fascinating to me is that your books, while they could all be termed mysteries or whatever you want, they're quite different. We're obviously huge Christie fans. We know you're a Christie fan. We are going to talk a lot more about Christie in a moment. But I think we were both struck by, especially in that you so often get the reference to Christie when people bring up your books, either in blurbs or articles. And that's a great thing, obviously. Like, I would imagine that you love that as much as we do. But
I do,
and you have some other influences that are quite striking. I know you've talked a little bit about this, but some of our favorites as well. The Death of Mrs. Westaway feels very saturated in the best of ways in the world of Daphne du Maurier. Obviously, the Turn of the Key,
which obviously we also want to note comes out in paperback, right?
It does, yes, this month, which is exciting. Yeah,
very exciting. But clearly Henry James.
Yeah, it's got a large dollop of Henry James. Although I actually hadn't read The Turn of the Screw when I started writing it, so the overlap was a weird kind of mix of deliberate and accidental with that book. The Death of Mrs. Westaway, I went into it knowing that I wanted to write not to du Maurier, but I'd written several novels that had been compared to Christie and which had kind of worn my Christie influences quite clearly on my sleeve. Probably The Woman in Cabin 10 being the most kind of Christie, deliberately Christie-ish. But I love du Maurier, and, she taught me everything I know about how to write character and how to sort of portray that kind of slow disintegration. And so writing a novel that was kind of set in Cornwall in a very Mandalay-ish sort of, crumbling Cornish country house was my way of sort of putting that front and centre and saying thank you to her. But writing The Turn of the Key, so I had the idea and kind of started writing it, and I knew I wanted to write someone who was in prison, and I sort of, I wanted it to be a nanny and all this kind of stuff. And got about halfway through and suddenly thought, gosh, I think I might be writing The Turn of the Screw. And although I hadn't read it, I knew enough about it, because it's such a well-known novel. I knew what it was about and I knew how it ended. And I think I might have even seen one of the films. And I thought, okay, if I'm going to do this, I have to do it deliberately, because otherwise if I'm just sort of blindly trampling around, not sure what I'm stealing and what I'm kind of, what I'm doing differently, that's not okay. So I then went back and read it and loved it. It's a very spooky story, but was really reassured, because what I was doing, although I was, obviously the book owes a huge debt to Henry James, and it does use a lot of the same tropes. Actually, ultimately, the questions that I was asking were different ones, and the stuff that I was talking about was different, and it ends up, I don't want to spoil either book for anyone, so I'll try and say this carefully, but it ends on a question which is a very different question to the one that The Turn of the Screw ends on, which also ends on a very big what if, but it's an entirely different one to the way my book goes. So.
Well, I mean, I think The Turn of the Screw ends up being psychological experiment, more or less, right? And your book is much more about family.
Yeah. And it's much more about, I think, because I write in the crime genre and readers of crime expect an answer. Like they expect a whodunit and they expect to know who done it at the end of it. And I wasn't going to break that part of the contract. I have a...
Although, Ruth, I've noticed you on Twitter, where we follow you, I've noticed you mention this to people in that there is ambiguity that you leave at the end of the turn of the key.
There's a big question, and there's stuff that the reader is supposed to know and stuff that they are not supposed to know, or stuff that they're supposed to decide for themselves. And I love, as a reader, when a writer trusts me to make that final step with the characters myself. And several of my books do end with the characters kind of mid-stride, as it were, sort of about to step off into another journey or to do something or to make a decision. And I enjoy leaving it up to the reader to figure out, what that decision might be or which way it might have gone. And the turn of the key is definitely no exception in that respect. There's a big question left at the end, which is up to the reader to decide. But the most important question in a crime novel is who done it. And that question is answered.
Is answered. You answered one of my other questions, because I was so fascinated by the turn of the key in that, big fan of Turn of the Screw. And I said, okay, so this is going to be a modern retelling of the Turn of the Screw. And it's really not. The setup is obviously similar. And then you go off in your own direction. And I was going to just ask, how exactly did that happen? And I think that's fascinating that you had a scenario that was then in its similarity to the Turn of the Screw, something that did become somewhat inspired by it, but is very much your own creation. And I think you can really feel that in the book. I really loved the Turn of the Key.
Oh, thank you. But yeah, I think,
it's quite
Henry
gripping
James
and moving too.
He really shaped the way that we think about nannies and childcare, and so many films and novels about nannies and sort of interacting with spooky children, from the others onwards, they reference straight back to James. So absolutely, the title is a nod to the fact that we all owe him an enormous debt. But yeah, it's not a retelling, and I wouldn't want anyone to think that it was. But
yeah, well, it's great because I was drawn in by that, and then very surprised,
and then I tricked you.
You tricked me. But hey, when you're opening a Ruth Ware novel, you're asking to be tricked. So
I think you expect a few twists. I think that's okay. Yeah. That's part of the deal.
And also to circle back to Du Maurier with the death of Mrs. Westaway, I think one of the other things that Kemper and I both have noticed is that, of course, it owes that Cornwall debt to Du Maurier, but also one of our favorite Christie novels is Peril at End House.
Oh, I love that.
And you're sort of getting a strong vibe of Peril at End House there too.
Absolutely, yeah. And actually, this is difficult because I don't want to spoil Peril at End House or the death of Mrs. Westaway, but there is a particular plot point which the two books kind of share. I took inspiration from Peril at End House for one particular point.
You did. Okay, that's very satisfying because I needed to know that. I'm pretty sure this is true, but this has to be inspired Peril. We won't get any more specific than that because we don't want to spoil any readers of both of those books, and I'm sure there are many listening right now. We'll also know exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think people will notice there is a specific commonality. Yeah,
that's lovely. I was so curious if The Woman in Cabin 10, if that had been in any way directly inspired by Ethelina White's The Wheel Spins, which is more famously adapted by Hitchcock as The Lady Vanishes, which has a similar setup, but I wondered if that was in any way a direct inspiration.
I don't know about direct, because actually when I wrote it, I hadn't read the story or seen the film, but I knew the basic premise of someone who had been there and then wasn't. So I guess indirectly, in that sense, it was. And the name, Lo Blacklock's name, is a steal from Christie, although not there's no other influences, because Letitia Blacklock is a character in A Murder Is Announced. But yeah, in other ways, that's entirely unrelated to the book.
Oh, I'm so mad at myself I didn't pick up on that, but yeah, of course. I also love how you often insert little interstitials that almost titillate the reader, and they're usually very suspenseful and further along whatever the mystery plot is, but punctuate the main narrative. And I think The Woman in Cabin 10 has some great examples of that. And by far my favorite is the online readers board of mystery lovers with their screen handles.
I had such fun doing that.
I could tell one of them is the name is Marple, Jane Marple, I believe.
Yeah, no, it was. So for anyone who hasn't read that book, I had this problem when I started writing it, which is that the crime doesn't happen until quite a long way through the book. And of course, I'd only written one book at that point. I'd only written In a Dark, Dark Wood. And so I think as you get a bit further along, people know that you will eventually come up with the goods and that this is a mystery novel and that there will be a murder. But I felt I hadn't kind of established that clearly enough. So I used kind of found documents and sort of snippets throughout the narrative to basically give people a heads up that, this is coming. Don't worry, there's going to be a disappearance and a death and so on. So the inserted documents are always one step ahead of the narrative in telling you what's going to happen. And halfway through, there's this, which originally was one of the latest things that I wrote in the book. So originally there was a storyline from Lo's boyfriend Judah's point of view. And he was a narrator, and it got taken out because it didn't work for lots of reasons. But I had to find some way of inserting his experience into the narrative in a different way. And so it kind of enabled me to get his voice on the page. So he goes onto this message board where everybody, like these sort of amateur armchair detectives, are sort of discussing Lo's disappearance and kind of takes them to task for all the assumptions that they're making about the case and about Lo's character.
No, it's great. But it's like, you can also tell, it's like you're not just making the most obvious references either, because the Sherlock reference is I am Sherlocked, which is like, yeah. I was like, oh, okay. So you've been enjoying the Benedict Cumberbatch
I am a fan.
Series,
yeah.
just like all of us. Okay.
But that's the fun about doing internet stuff, is that people are so clever and so self-referential, and not everybody will pick up on that, of course, but the people who do will enjoy it. So yeah. The Woman in Cabin 10. I mean, I know you get a lot of references to Murder on the Orient Express, probably just because it's one of Christie's most well-known, that also has the kind of isolated, truly closed circle settings. But I of course also thought of Death on the Nile, and not only similarly small-ish boat, and the small, the cramped quarters of it too, you use to such brilliant effect, I think, for it to kind of convey the claustrophobia of the setting. And I think Chris kind of does that as well, where it's like, wow, these people are just like running around, within feet of each other the entire novel. But it's interesting that you mention how late the murder is in your book, because it's the same thing in Death on the Nile. I mean, Death on the Nile is a really substantial Christie, and we don't get our murder until about halfway through. And it's just pages upon pages of fascinating sort of character study. But obviously, by that point, I think Christie could rely on the fact that I'm going to have a murder in my book. So yeah, exactly. She had, established herself by that point. Although there are hints early on, I think, aren't there? Because, Lynette has various attempts made on her life as you go through. So there's a kind of, there is a sense that, we're building up to this and we're gonna get to the crunch at some point. But that's true. I agree. I love Death on the Nile, and it's so well done. And I think the thing that I really stole from that book and from Murder on the Orient Express as well, which went directly into The Woman in Cabin 10, was what Christie does so well is that kind of atmosphere of stifled luxury where everything on paper is perfect, and it's this incredibly luxurious setting, and it's full of servants, and the food is amazing, and it in some ways it's everybody's dream holiday. But what she does so cleverly is turn it into a complete nightmare, and she really shows the flip side of that, and how these sort of entitled aristocratic people are actually this sort of nest of absolute vipers who are kind of all at each other's throats, and they're all defrauding each other and fighting and stealing each other's husbands and stuff. And I completely lifted that and tried to put that straight into Cabin 10.
It's actually an interesting thread through most of your last books is that sort of decaying luxury or luxury
Decadence.
decadence that has gone awry, because it's the case in The Road in Cabin 10, it's the case in The Death of Mrs. Westaway, and it's certainly the case in The Turn of the Key.
Yeah, and actually my new book, which is coming out this autumn, which is called One by One, it is a theme in that as well. That's set in a luxurious ski chalet in the French Alps, and an avalanche kind of descends on the chalet and cuts the inhabitants off from all hope of rescue, really. And the electricity goes out, and of course people start to die, because it's one of my books. And it's exactly that sort of thing of, you know, the canapes are sort of curling at the edges, and there's, you know, croissant crumbs in the rug because they can't hoover, and this sort of what starts out as this kind of picture perfect vista just gets slowly more and more sort of frayed around the edges. It's interesting. I don't know why I am so obsessed with this as a
Well,
theme,
I think maybe you are just very much good at reading the signs of the times, Ruth.
I don't know. No, it's true, but I don't. Because so many other writers do kind of gritty poverty really well, and that's just not it's just not what I write. But
it's the curdling of the creme fraiche, you know?
Yeah. That's a great phrase. I might steal that.
Go for it.
I remember from The Woman in Cabin 10, at one point, Lo sits down and she eats a sandwich in mineral water, which you're like, okay, that sounds lovely, sandwich in mineral water. You managed to make it so revolting because you describe it's hard-boiled egg and prawns, and then the mineral water has been sitting there, and there's just rivulets of water and condensation running down, and she's stuffing the sandwich in her mouth because she vomited out her breakfast. It's just like, it's just a mess, and I cherish it.
The other interesting thing, one of the best elements of Turn of the Key is that sort of surveillance culture, which is so omnipresent. And we were talking about Zoom earlier, right? And, you know, there is that element of you're being watched.
Yeah. Well, so one of the big inspirations for that book, other than obviously the sort of, you know, the Henry James side, was when I was kind of, you know, researching ideas for new plots and things, I kept coming across these articles about digital abuse and kind of online stalking and stuff. And it, you know, at the time I was writing, it was becoming more and more of a problem, and the law just wasn't really equipped to deal with it. And, you know, you were having these situations where, you know, typically one partner had set up all the security system in the house, and there were cameras and speakers and sometimes very sophisticated systems with, you know, smart locks and all sorts of surveillance, and the other partner just went along with it, and because it made their life, you know, more convenient and more secure, and then the relationship breaks down, and suddenly what used to be something to keep everybody safe becomes a means of terrorizing one, you know, member of the household. And there were more and more of these things coming up. And now if you look online, you know, you can get guides on how to digitally detox your relationship when you've broken up with someone, because they may have put trackers on your phone. They may be listening to you through your home hub. They may have, you know, access to all your devices. And the fact that we have to think about this in the context of modern relationships is just, you know, definitely not something Christie ever had to worry about.
No, not it. I mean, I'll share a personal anecdote. I'm alone in lockdown, but I do have an Alexa. And this was a few nights ago, and I was like, what is going on in my bedroom? Because there were lights. And then I realized that Alexa had been on the entire time. Like the blue circling light had just been on, and I unplugged it.
Yeah, she's been listening to you all that time.
All that time. Amazon, you know, use it to order toilet paper, and also apparently she uses it to listen to my conversations.
That is really weird, isn't it? One of my friends figured out how to, so you can program Alexa to give you reminders. So she'd program in a reminder, but obviously it wouldn't be an actual reminder. When she was away on holiday, she had it coming up saying to her husband, I'm watching you. I know what you've been doing. And he'd be just like cooking the dinner or something. His voice would come out of Alexa. And she said, like, she just got this call going, oh my God, what's going on? Alexa's talking to me. And she had to say, I'm so sorry, it was me.
That's Very funny.
So, that was quite benign, but it could have been used for very, very ill effect.
No, I love in The Turn of the Key too, just the ultimate irony of how difficult it is for her to turn on the freaking lights. It's like she can't, and it's used to such good effect in a thriller, right? Because she's in the dark then, and she doesn't know what's going on, and it's so frustrating. But I think everyone knows exactly what that is like. The irony of technology that's meant to make things easier, doing the exact opposite. And I think
just does not. I know. I think that came directly out of coming off tour, and I had been in so many hotel rooms where there was just one light that I just couldn't figure out how to turn it off, and you just end up hiding it behind a chair or pulling it out of the plug or something. That frustration went straight into the book.
It's interesting, like you said, obviously Christie wasn't dealing with those specific issues in her novels, which is true because she's not writing 21st century, but I love Christie and also love your novels because I think that, contrary sometimes to popular belief, Christie actually was dealing with these sorts of issues that people were grappling with day to day. It's so much more effective reading a book that's about something else, but that also is infused with something like income inequality or class struggle or how problematic technology may be in our own lives. That's not a message, it's not a message story about that, but the message comes across that stronger for that because we're so engrossed in the book.
I completely agree. I think Christie is a much more progressive writer than she's sometimes given credit for. Obviously she's conservative with a small c, and she has, a particular kind of worldview, and there's servants and blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, she centered as her two main detectives a Belgian refugee, who was a war refugee in the UK. Belgian refugees were not particularly popular in the UK at the point at which she was writing those books because, they were struggling with the same issues that we struggle with today in terms of how asylum seekers are perceived in the media and so on. Mm-hmm. And then, fast forward 20 years, and who does she choose for her next big detective? It's one of the so-called generation of surplus women whose, fiancés and sweethearts were killed off during the war. She's a spinster, she's alone, she's impoverished, she's routinely dismissed by everybody. And in fact, her secret superpower is that, no one takes her seriously. So they say things to her that they wouldn't say to anybody else. And she uses that to skewer wrongdoers. And, I do think exactly as you say, she is grappling with these big questions of class and nationality and so on. But she does it in a very light touch way where it's not, she doesn't
until she doesn't. I mean, to circle back to the Peril at End House reference, Peril at End House is essentially about the failing of a generation. It's about, the pretty young things going to pot, as it were.
Yeah.
And I find that fascinating, that sort of idea of witnessing the decay of a social class and of a generation in the case of Peril at End House, right?
Yeah, in a way, it's kind of weirdly secret history from the opposite perspective, but it is sort of about people being sort of undone by decadence and privilege and entitlement kind of thing.
Absolutely.
That's actually, we've never talked about that, but that's like a very good reference, I think.
Yeah, for Peril at End House. No, it's true. They're about the exact same thing and dealing with the exact same characters, just from different ends.
Entirely different perspectives. No, exactly.
Yeah. I actually had a quick question because I can't help myself on perspective and voice. You obviously, for the most part, write in the first person. So it's very effective because, you're with one person's perspective and inside their head, obviously, as they're experiencing all of this. But there's one major exception, which is the death of Mrs. Westaway, which is in an extremely close, other than you do have it interspersed with letters, of course, but it's an extremely close third person. And I actually had to go back and check that it wasn't in first person before putting this question down, because it almost gives off the effect of being first person, even though it's not. And I was just curious why you decided to do that.
Well, they're all slightly different, although most of them are first person. They're all in slightly different tenses.
Mm-hmm.
In a ... Wood is obviously in a mixture of present and past, because the present section she's in hospital and the past sections she's remembering. And the lying game is sort of similarly structured because there's so much past tense stuff in that the present, she's in the present for the present and the past for the past. So all of them are sort of slightly differently arranged. And then, of course, the turn of the key is is epistolary, which was a completely different challenge.
Sure.
So that's a kind of a you voice in a way. And so part of it was simply that I sat down to write The Death of Mrs. Westaway and thought, I haven't done third person, and I probably should. It was sort of almost like kind of ticking it off the list thing. Like, what haven't I done yet? I haven't done third person.
Take that off your bucket list.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'll probably return to it. But part of it was because it just felt right for the type of book that I was trying to write, which was something, I don't know, a little bit old-fashioned, a little bit gothic, a little bit Daphne du Maurier, although actually most of her books are in first. But, it had a sort of slightly kind of, I don't know, it just had a slightly sort of old world feeling to it that seemed right for the book. And then with The Turn of the Key, I was like, okay, what do I do now? And the answer was epistolary.
We actually just covered A Pocket Full of Rye on the podcast. That's the last book that we did. And none of Christie's novels is obviously fully in letters, but that's one where there's a letter at the end of the novel that packs quite a punch and is quite moving and powerful. And letters are so often clues as physical objects or as, pieces of writing. And
or as the thing that sort of kicks it all off. Like, in terms of the moving finger, it's all, the anonymous letters are what sort of pushes the narrative forward, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely. Before we get into some, I think, Christie-focused questions, I did just want to ask you, because I was also interested, just from a writerly perspective, I noticed that you wrote 5 YA fantasy novels before turning to psychological crime, suspense, thriller mysteries.
I did, yeah.
And also under a slightly different name as well. I was just curious how the pivot from that to writing what you did came about. Did you always know that you wanted to ultimately turn to what you write now? Will you go back to doing some more YA? How did that all work?
Well, it's sort of, it was more just how if I talk about it now, it sort of makes it sound like I had some kind of grand career plan in place. And the truth is, I really didn't. But I don't know. I think I ended up writing, so the first book that I ever published was my first YA novel. And I was on maternity leave with my second baby. So I was spending an awful lot of time in the children's section of the library with my older child, who was sort of about 3 or 4 at the time. And, there's only so many Thomas the Tank Engine books you can read, and only so many times you can read The Very Hungry Caterpillar. And so I ended up, more often than not, reaching for a YA book because they were in the same section while my kids, played around on the floor and stacked blocks or whatever. And so I rediscovered this whole section of the library that I hadn't read YA for years, since I've been a teenager myself. And I just had this idea for a YA novel, and I wrote it, and I'd written for years and years and years, but ended up putting all the books under the bed in all sorts of different genres. But having written this book, I thought, gosh, I haven't got time for this anymore. I'm on maternity leave, but I'll be going back to work very soon. And when I do, I'm going to have 2 kids, a pretty full-on job, all the other demands on my time, not enough childcare. And I'm not going to have time to do this anymore. So I have to find a way to keep this in my life. I have to take it seriously. And I think that was what made me finally pluck up the courage and decide to properly sub to agents. So that was the book that got me my agent, and I wrote 5 YA novels. And then I had an idea for a crime novel, and a friend said to me that she had never read a thriller set on a hen night, and we were both kind of thriller junkies. And as soon as she said it, I started racking my brains and kind of thinking, gosh, I haven't either, and that's really strange because it's a really good idea. And I went back to my agent and said, I think I want to write a crime novel. And to do her credit, she was completely she was like, okay, fine, we'll make it work. So I wrote what became In a Dark, Dark Wood, that understandably, when I subbed it to my now publishers, they were a little bit worried about my sort of teenage readers stumbling across this rather sweary, murderous, violent book with people, taking drugs and acting in inappropriate ways. And my YA publishers were also, they didn't want that to sort of angry parents ringing up saying, my child got this book out of the library and it's completely unsuitable. So I tweaked my name just enough to make it clear that there was a difference between the two. And I didn't want, it's not a secret, it's out on the internet and stuff, but there's a clear branding difference between these for kids and these are for adults.
I do have to say, though, Ruth, that perhaps it would behoove younger readers to just know the perils of hen nights, because I know as someone who has certainly been on my share, the trauma lasts for many years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, I do have a surprising number of teen readers. I get quite a lot of 14 and 15-year-olds writing to me and saying, I read this book and I really enjoyed it. But I figure if their parents let them go into it knowing it was an adult book, fair enough. That's absolutely fine. God knows, I was reading some incredibly screwed up stuff aged 14 and 15. So I am, if they're equipped to handle it, that's absolutely fine by me. But I just didn't want to ambush people with content that they weren't ready for.
Is Ruth Ware also then a pseudonym?
No, so my actual name is Ruth Warburton. So I wrote my first book under my real name. And then because In a Wood was such a long title, when I was casting around for what could my crime name be, the art department said we need it to be a short name. And so I just thought, fine, I'll just knock a couple of syllables off.
And that makes so much more sense. So Ruth Ware is the slight pseudonym. You started out with your full name.
It's been misreported a couple of times as the other way around, but I think that's just because people encountered me as Ware first, so they assume that that's my actual name. But
they assume that's the that's how I came across it. And I was like, wow, that is curious that she went from pseudonymous to not, but it obviously makes sense the other way. We obviously wanted to talk a little bit about Christie since we are all super fans on this call. It's funny, at one point on Twitter a year or two ago, kind of had an open-ended question of like, okay, guys, let's rank our favorite Christies, with an acknowledgement of what a fraught sort of question that is among Christie enthusiasts, because there are so many different answers. And I remember that we got into a very spirited and lively discussion, and you were actually the first one to make the point about how Miss Marple does in fact age in the later novels, which I had never really appreciated. And we're only now, having just finished A Pocket Full of Rye, we're only just getting to those later novels. I just wanted to thank you for that insight into Christie. But I'm curious, do you have a favorite Christie?
It's very difficult. I do, but it changes all the time. I have a kind of a core of favorite Christies. So obviously, like the big ones, And Then There Were None, Murder on the Orient Express, Murder of Roger Ackroyd would have to be up there. But I think, much as I love Poirot, and I do love Poirot, I just love Miss Marple so much. She's there's not enough badass old ladies in fiction, full stop.
Ruth, you just made Kemper's entire life possibly.
I just passed out from an overabundant joy. Now, I in fact just died. This is now Ghost Kemper on the call. But you keep on precipitating my questions, because I was going to try to make you choose between Poirot and Marple, and it sounds like Miss Marple is your favorite detective.
I think she is. I think that many of the Poirot books are more perfect books. They're more beautifully plotted. They're more original in terms of what they brought to the genre. And you have to remember that by the time Christie was writing the Marple books, she had written probably 30 or 40 novels by that point. So she couldn't repeat herself. And, the fact that she brings so much originality to the Marple plots, I think is remarkable. So I think in terms of the plots that I admire and the setups that I admire and the kind of the inventiveness, so much of what we take for granted about the genre, Christie either invented or popularized. The idea that the narrator could be the murderer, when Christie wrote a novel, I won't say which one, that violated that rule, people were genuinely up in arms, and she got absolutely kind of furious letters about it, sort of saying, you betrayed the contract of trust, and it was, it was really an original thing to do. But that doesn't appear so much in the Miss Marple novels, because, she was an established writer, and I think had used up a certain amount of her powder on Poirot at that point. But I think Miss Marple she's just such a a radical character. And, even now in the 21st century, we don't have many detectives like Miss Marple. They're still, by and large, male, middle-aged, hard-drinking, white dude policeman. And to put a kind of a frail elderly lady who's a bit fluffy and a bit confused and spends most of her time knitting in her village, to put her front and centre and say, she is one of the finest minds in Britain, I still think it was brilliant. I just love it. Well, so yeah, I would choose Marple as my favourite detective, but I might choose a Poirot novel as being, like, if I were trying to tempt someone to Christie, I would probably recommend them to a Poirot novel first, because I think they showcase Christie's talent a bit better than some of them.
I actually really love your take on Miss Marple. I think a lot of our listeners think that I don't like Miss Marple. I have a running joke that it's actually Dark Marple, because you kind of always wonder about her motivation slightly, because she has such this weird amount of knowledge about every single person in St. Mary Mead.
Yeah.
And so you kind of are a little bit always on edge, and like, she is dangerous, right? I mean,
oh my God, yeah. She literally stabbed someone with her knitting needles in one book.
Yeah, I mean, right. And she's described, again, we just did a pocket full of rye, and she's described as showing up as essentially an avenging angel. And I think that she's fluffy hair and knitting needles and all, she's actually in some ways more dangerous than Poirot.
Oh, for sure. I mean, Poirot very, very rarely puts himself in physical danger. Actually, the final Poirot curtain is one of the few novels where he does do that. But as you get towards the end of the Miss Marple canon and the sort of later books where she's older and frailer, that kind of inner steel, in a weird kind of way, becomes more obvious. And it's sort of like her personality gets kind of pared back. And there's a moment in Murder in the Caribbean, I think it is, where she's talking to Mr. Raphael, and Christie says suddenly it was as if the old lady personality had been put aside and this flash of steel came out, and Mr. Raphael is kind of taken aback by this. And I just think it's so well done, the way she presents Marple almost as this kind of, not as a wolf in sheep's clothing, but definitely an iron hand in a velvet glove. And as the novels go on and she sort of gets frailer and frailer, the iron hand, I think, becomes a little bit more obvious. I love all the Marple novels, but I think the final couple are my favourites.
The last few Miss Marples are your favorites?
Yeah, probably Nemesis is my absolute favourite. I just think it's so well done, and it's so clear-sighted about the sort of frustrations and frailties of old age. I mean, I've never been an old lady, so I don't know if this is true, but I feel like by the time she was writing, Christie certainly had been an elderly lady. Yep. And, Nemesis is all about how Miss Marple wants to defeat these people, but she is old and her joints hurt and she can't walk long distances and she needs to sit down every 10 minutes, and she somehow got to thwart a killer in spite of all these frailties. And of course, the brilliant thing is that she does.
Yeah, I love that. I also particularly love that because we haven't gotten to Nemesis yet. And I think one thing we were worried about, because our project is that we're going in chronological order of, publication of the novels. And we had this fear, and so many listeners, contact us with the same thing, saying, oh, it's going to get rough in the last decade or decade and a half in the 60s and 70s. And I'm not sure that that's true, because I think that there are a lot of gems. There are obviously some that are less than gems, but she, her powers were there up until the end. And I think I love that idea that in Nemesis, in writing about old age, from the perspective of someone who was dealing with it at the time, that there's a power there. It's been a long time since I read that one, but I'm very excited when we get to it, approximately 2 years from now or so. We move slowly. Ruth.
It's a lifetime's endeavor. You take your time. No, I mean, I have to say, I do think the very last Christie's, you can tell that she is tired And
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of the Tommy and Tuppence novels anyway. So I think her final novel is Poston of Fate, which is a Tommy and Tuppence. Well, unless you count the ones that were published posthumously. Yeah, it's not they are not my favourite detectives, and that's not, I don't think it was a novel that particularly showed her strength. I don't enjoy the Tommy and Tuppence novels, full stop. I find them incredibly irritating as a couple, and the novels are irritating as well. And,
wait,
yeah,
are you saying, Ruth, that you don't like that Tommy gets bashed over the head every single time?
Well, I don't know. There's a certain pleasure in seeing him, physically brought low. But part of you just feels, why do you keep going back for it, Tommy? Just pull yourself together. Take up a more befitting pastime like playing cricket or gardening, and leave the detecting to Poirot and Marple, who are frankly much better at it.
Or leave it to your wife, who is clearly better at it.
Who is clearly the more intelligent one of the pair. We haven't yet gotten to By the Pricking of My Thumbs, which some people do highlight as potentially the best of the Tommy and Tuppence novels because it is the creepiest, and they're older, but not quite to the advanced age of Postern of Fate. So I am looking forward to that one.
I think the thing is, if you only looked at the standalone novels like And Then There Were None or Endless Night, or you only looked at the Poirot novels, or you only looked at the Marple novels, each of those canons would mean that Christie was still a respected crime writer. If you took away all of the other novels and you were just left with those, then on the strength of And Then There Were None and Endless Night and the various other non kind of detective novels, Christie would still be regarded as one of the finest detective writers of the 20th century. If you were left only with the Tommy and Tuppence novels, I would struggle to make that case.
That's an excellent way of putting it. I never thought of it that way. That's
fair but brutal, I think.
No, you're right. Absolutely right.
One of the things that I did want to touch on also was your engagement as a writer on Twitter, because I find you to be very engaged.
Oh, I like being on Twitter. I'm not so, I enjoy posting on Instagram and, I like comments and stuff on there, but I don't feel like it's my medium. I don't really understand how Instagram works, and I feel a bit sort of, like an old person kind of puttering around going, what's this button do? Whereas Twitter feels like I'm swimming in a sea that I understand, and I love, it's just a nice place to chat to readers and
I think the engagement level is nice, and I'm always interested in how writers in particular are sort of interacting via writing. And you're right, on Instagram. I mean, I'm a millennial and I still don't know what Instagram really is.
I find it so weird that you can't retweet. I know you can sort of regram, but it requires you to jump through about 4,000 hoops, and it doesn't feel like my medium. Maybe because Twitter is all words. So I still slightly miss the days when you had to write RT before cutting and pasting someone's tweet in order to retweet it. But, I realise that makes me sound like a granny.
But a very hip granny.
Too kind.
We should tell listeners out there, in case they don't yet follow you on Twitter, what your Twitter handle is.
It is Ruth Ware Writer, or one word.
Fantastic. As we mentioned at one point during this discussion, you do have the paperback version of The Turn of the Key coming out very shortly.
I do, yeah, coming out in May. So hopefully some bookshops will still be open in order for people to buy it. But if not, I hope it provides some lockdown, escapism for people. It's trying times out there at the moment. So
absolutely. Well, we highly recommend it, as we do all of your novels.
Yeah, and also we should make an effort to encourage all of our listeners to support their local bookshops, because
absolutely
they can do it either by calling their local bookshops directly, or there is Bookshop, which is a new service in the US that they can use. I don't know if there's an equivalent in the UK, but we should be supporting them because they're going to give you the best recommendations anyway. And this is a podcast about literature, so let's support them.
Absolutely. And, it's tough times for everybody, but it's really tough times for bricks and mortar shops. And if we don't support them through this, we're not going to find them on our high streets at the end of it. So yeah, absolutely. If people possibly can, the bookshops, the physical bookshops are closed, but the booksellers often are still out there on Twitter making recommendations, taking orders by phone. In the UK, you can use Hive, which is a sort of equivalent to IndieBound, I guess, where it gives a percentage to your local shop. So if people are in a position to support their local bookshops, it would mean a lot.
Well, thank you so much for taking time. This has been, as I said, something we have wanted to do and been looking forward to pretty much for the lifetime of this podcast. And it was an absolute delight.
Oh, it was my complete pleasure. It's such, fun to be among fellow Agatha appreciators. And your podcast is brilliant. And I very much enjoyed shooting the breeze.
Thank you so much, Ruth.
Thank you.
Will do. All right.
Well, that was just absolutely fantastic. I could not have been more thrilled with everything that we were able to talk about with such a both obviously experienced but also thoughtful mystery writer and fan. I was really struck by a lot of the insights that Ruth gave us as to her thoughts on, mysteries in general, the writing process, and also Christie. Quite specifically, she
knows her Christie, and I appreciated it so much, right?
I did too. And I mean, I think it's not that came as a surprise. I think it was a quite pleasant surprise just how articulate she was and how good she was at conveying some really keen perceptions on Christie and other topics as well. So again, we are just so grateful that she took the time to sit down with us. And I hope that you all enjoyed listening to that conversation as much as we did having it.
Yeah. And to reiterate what we said on the podcast, her novel, The Turn of the Key, is out in paperback. Please buy it from your local bookshop. Again, you can do it on bookshop.org in the United States. That gives a portion of the proceeds back to the booksellers. We don't have any sort of financial interest in that at all, but I do think that in this time when you want to support local businesses, either you should call them directly or use something that is actually giving back to them. We want them to stay open.
We want our independent bookshops and booksellers to stay in business, and now is the time that I think we need to think of them and do what we can to help them out more than ever. We're obviously fans of book buying and book consuming however you do it.
Yeah,
but
unfortunately, my house looks like a hoarder's house of book piles. So,
but we just wanted to give that little extra plug, and we have also linked to a couple of helpful places online in terms of independent bookstores and how you might be able to connect with them wherever you are. So check us out on our social media, which is a seamless transition into the end of our episode. We should mention that we will see you next episode for the Labors of Hercules. We've got two very interesting stories, the Lernaean Hydra and the Arcadian Deer. So stay tuned for some Papa Poirot.
I always get excited about it.
You always do. We, of course, have our Patreon site. We've been welcoming some new members there recently. Should you want some additional content, we would love to have you over there. And we've mentioned this before, but our Magpie Murders episode, that wonderful mystery novel by Anthony Horowitz, is free to the public. So go on over there if you would like to listen to that, see what else we have going on. That's at www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha. You can always email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. We love to hear from you. We love having pen pals. We are on Twitter at allaboutthedame. Catherine is on Twitter at Brobcat. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha, and we are on Instagram at All About Agatha. And as always, we so appreciate the ratings and reviews. If you have not given us one of those yet, please do, wherever you're listening to this podcast. All right, see you next time. Bye.
Bye.